Welcome to another deep dive where we delve into some fascinating stuff. I always find it interesting how stories can help us understand the world around us. And today we're going to be looking at how one author's vision of the future kind of feels a little too close to home right now.
Oh, yeah. I know what you mean.
We're talking about Octavia Butler,
Yeah.
right? One of the most celebrated science fiction writers out there.
Exactly. And her work is just so relevant. It's almost scary how she seemed to predict so many of the things we're dealing with today.
Right. And specifically, we're going to be diving into her novel, Parable of the Sower, which paints this pretty bleak picture of a future America ravaged by climate change, social unrest, you name it.
It's a dystopian world, but it's one that feels eerily familiar in a lot of ways, especially when we look at things like the wildfires in California or the rise of certain ideologies like white Christian nationalism.
Okay, so before we jump into the specifics of the novel itself, let's give our listeners a little bit of background on Octavia Butler and why her work is so important.
Sure. So Butler was a groundbreaking science fiction author, and she really focused on the experiences of Black women in these kind of dystopian futures.
Right, and she wasn't afraid to tackle some really tough themes,
Mm.
right? Like power, inequality, survival.
Exactly. And she often did this through protagonists who are challenging oppressive systems, trying to create change.
And one thing that really struck me in Parable of the Sower is how she portrays the dangers of concentrated power, especially when it comes to media control.
Oh, absolutely. That was a huge concern for Butler. Who controls the narratives we consume, who shapes the information we get.
And in the world of Parable of the Sower, it's like a handful of powerful individuals or corporations who are basically dictating what people see and hear.
Right. And that has huge implications for democracy, freedom of thought, the whole works.
And it's kind of like what we're seeing today, right? With a few billionaires owning these massive media empires, controlling the flow of information for millions of people.
It's a scary parallel for sure. And it makes you wonder, how much control they have over public opinion, how they might manipulate events to their advantage.
It's like those algorithms that curate our news feeds, or the way social media platforms can amplify certain voices while silencing others. It's getting harder and harder to know what to believe.
That's a big part of what Butler was warning us about. The dangers of unchecked power, the erosion of truth in a society where information is controlled by so few.
And it's especially concerning in a time when people are feeling anxious and uncertain, looking for easy answers. They become more susceptible to manipulation, to those kind of populist leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems.
Right. And that brings us to another unsettling connection to the novel, The Rise of Populism and Authoritarianism Around the World.
It's like that whole Make America Great Again movement.
Sure.
It definitely tapped into a lot of anxiety and nostalgia, but it also had this kind of undercurrent of us versus them thinking, right?
For sure. And while the Magier movement is just one example, we're seeing similar trends globally, where leaders are using fear and division to consolidate their power.
And it's like Butler saw this coming, decades ago. She showed how these charismatic leaders can exploit fear and uncertainty, use media to silence dissent.
It's a cautionary tale for sure, and one that feels all too relevant today.
So even before we get into the nitty-gritty of the plot, we're already seeing these unsettling parallels between Parable of the Sower and our current reality. It's like Butler was holding up a mirror to society, warning us about the dangers ahead.
And it's a warning we should definitely heed.
Okay, so we've talked about the themes of power, control, and manipulation. Now let's actually step into the world of Parable of the Sower. What's the setting like? What kind of future is Butler depicting?
Well, imagine a near future America, but instead of flying cars and technological marvels, it's a nation in decline. Climate change has ravaged the environment, the economy's collapsed, and society's basically broken down.
So it's not exactly a pretty picture.
Not at all resources are scarce water, a luxury, and danger lurks around every corner.
And this is the world that our protagonist, Lauren Olamina, is born into.
Right, and Lauren, she's not your typical hero. She's this young Black woman who possesses something called hyperempathy, which means she can literally feel the pain and pleasure of others.
Wow, so imagine experiencing the world with that kind of heightened sensitivity, especially in a society that's falling apart.
It's both a gift and a curse, right? It makes her incredibly compassionate, but also incredibly vulnerable.
It's like she's feeling the pulse of this dying world.
Exactly, and that shapes her entire worldview. She sees the cracks in society, the desperation, and the looming threat of total collapse.
So how does she cope with all of this? What does she do?
Well, instead of giving in to despair, she develops her own belief system, something she calls Earthseed, as a way to make sense of the chaos and find a path forward.
Earthseed, that sounds almost spiritual. Is it like a religion?
It's more of a philosophy for survival, really. It's rooted in pragmatism, adaptability, and this understanding that God is change.
So it's about embracing change as inevitable and finding a way to thrive within it.
Exactly. It's about understanding that the old ways are failing and that we need new ways of thinking and being to survive in this new reality.
Okay, now I'm starting to see how this connects to some of the things we were talking about earlier. Climate change, social unrest, people searching for meaning and connection in a world that feels increasingly chaotic.
It's all there. And I think that's one of the reasons why Parable of the Sower resonates so strongly with readers today. It captures the anxieties of our age, the sense that we're living in a time of profound transformation.
And it's a reminder that we have choices to make, right? We can either cling to the past or we can embrace the future and find a way to create something new.
That's the challenge Butler throws down to us. And it's one that we'll be exploring further as we continue our deep dive into Parable of the Sower.
Welcome back. Last time we were talking about Lauren Olamina and how she's trying to make sense of this chaotic world she lives in.
Right, she's definitely not just sitting around waiting for things to get better. She's taking action.
Yeah, with this whole Earthseed philosophy, it seems like she's trying to create something new, a way to not just survive, but actually thrive in this kind of broken world.
Absolutely, and one of the core principles of Earthseed is that God is change.
Okay, I'm curious about that. What does that even mean?
Well, it's not about worshiping a deity in the traditional sense, but it's more about recognizing that change is like the fundamental force in the universe.
So it's about accepting that things are always in flux.
Exactly. And instead of resisting change, Earthseed is about embracing it, adapting to it, even shaping it to our own ends.
So it's not about being a victim of circumstance, it's about taking control.
Right, and that's a big part of what makes Lauren such a compelling character. She's not waiting for someone to save her. She's taking charge of her own destiny.
And she's not doing it alone.
Yeah.
Right? She starts building this community around Earthseed.
Exactly. She attracts people who are also disillusioned with the old ways, who are looking for something new, something that actually works in this new reality.
And these are people from all walks of life, right? It's not just like a group of fringe dwellers or something.
Well, no, not at all. There's a real diversity in Lauren's community. There's a doctor, a teacher, even a former corporate executive, all seeking a different way of being in the world.
It's like a microcosm of society itself coming together to build something new out of the ruins of the old.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it speaks to this idea that even in the midst of crisis, there's potential for growth, for transformation.
Okay, I'm seeing how this connects to what we were talking about earlier with those wildfires in California. It's not just an environmental disaster, it's a social and economic one too, and it's often the most vulnerable communities that get hit the hardest.
Right. They're the ones on the front lines dealing with the immediate consequences, but they're also often the ones who are leading the way in terms of resilience, community building, and finding creative solutions.
So even in the face of devastation, there's this incredible human capacity for adaptation, for coming together and supporting each other.
Absolutely. And I think Parable of the Sower really highlights that. It shows us that even in the darkest of times, there's still hope. There's still the possibility of connection and collective action.
I like that it's a reminder that we're not alone in these challenges and that by working together, we can find ways to overcome them.
And it's not just about survival. It's about creating something better, something more just and equitable.
But it's not all sunshine and roses in the novel,
Yeah.
where there are still real obstacles and dangers that Lauren and her community have to face.
Oh, definitely. Parable of the Sower doesn't sugarcoat the realities of trying to build a new world. It's a gritty and often violent struggle.
So what are some of the challenges they encounter?
Well, one of the biggest is simply the threat of violence. The world of Parable of the Sower is a dangerous place filled with people who are desperate and willing to do whatever it takes to survive.
So they're constantly on guard, having to protect themselves from those who would exploit or harm them.
Exactly. And this creates a real dilemma for Lauren and her community because they want to build a world based on compassion and cooperation, but they also have to be prepared to defend themselves.
It's like that classic conflict between those who want to cling to the old ways, even if they're destructive, and those who are trying to create something new.
Right. And it's not always easy to know how to navigate that, especially when violence seems like the only option.
So how do they deal with that? How do they stay true to their principles while still protecting themselves?
It's a tough question, and Butler doesn't shy away from the complexities of it. Lauren recognizes the need for self-defense, but she also refuses to let go of her empathy, her belief in the inherent worth of all people.
So it's not about becoming like the very people they're fighting against. It's about finding a way to resist violence without losing their own humanity.
And that's a challenge that resonates with a lot of what's happening in the world today, right? How do
Yeah.
we stand up for what's right without resorting to the same tactics of violence and oppression that we're trying to dismantle?
It's like walking a tightrope. You have to be strong and determined, but also compassionate and understanding.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important lessons we can take away from Parable of the Sower. It's a reminder that even in the midst of struggle, we can't lose sight of our values of our humanity.
It's a powerful message and one that we'll be exploring further as we continue our deep dive into Parable of the Sower. Welcome back to our deep dive. As we've been talking about Lauren and her community, one thing that keeps coming back to me is this idea of how do you stay compassionate? How do you hold on to your empathy in a world that's so full of violence and suffering?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And it's something that Butler explores really deeply in the novel. It's easy to become hardened to shut down emotionally when you're constantly confronted with pain and brutality.
Right. Especially in a world like the one she depicts, where things have really fallen apart and people are just trying to survive.
Yeah, exactly. But Butler shows us that it's precisely in those times that empathy becomes even more crucial. It's what allows us to connect with each other, to understand the root causes of violence, and to ultimately work towards creating a better world.
In the last part, we were talking about how Lauren and her community have to deal with this constant threat of violence. They have to be prepared to defend themselves.
Right, and it's a really tricky balance because they don't want to become like the very people they're trying to escape, those who use violence and oppression to maintain control.
So how do they navigate that? How do they stay true to their principles of compassion and community building while still protecting themselves?
Well, this is where Earthseed as a philosophy really comes into play. It's not just about adapting to change, it's about taking responsibility for shaping change, and that includes confronting violence, but not with a mindset of revenge or retribution.
So it's not about meeting violence with more violence.
Right. It's about understanding the root causes of violence, the poverty, the desperation, the fear that can drive people to do terrible things.
So it's about recognizing that cycle of violence and trying to break it.
Exactly. And this perspective really shapes how Lauren approaches self-defense. It's not about becoming desensitized to violence or embracing this idea that might makes right.
It's about protecting yourself and your community while still holding on to that empathy, that understanding that even those who commit acts of violence are still human beings capable of change.
And this reminds me of something we talked about earlier with right Christian nationalism. It's an ideology that often uses fear and exclusion to justify violence against those who are different.
Right? It's like they're creating this us versus them mentality where anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of belonging is seen as a threat.
And Earthseed offers a completely different perspective.
Hmm.
It's about embracing diversity, understanding that change is inevitable, and working together to create a future where everyone can thrive.
So how does Butler actually portray that clash of ideologies in the novel?
Well, there's this one really powerful scene where Lauren's group encounters a community that's basically become this heavily armed fortress.
Like they've completely isolated themselves from the outside world.
Right, and they claim to be upholding Christian values, but their actions are driven by fear and paranoia. They're deeply suspicious of anyone who doesn't conform to their beliefs.
It's like a perversion of faith, using it as a justification for exclusion and violence.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that any belief system, even one that's rooted in love and compassion, can be twisted and manipulated to serve less noble ends.
So how does Lauren's group respond to this? Do they try to reason with them?
Lauren quickly realizes that it's too dangerous to engage with this group directly. They're so entrenched in their fear that any attempt at dialogue could easily escalate into violence.
So it's a strategic retreat.
Right. It's about recognizing that sometimes the best course of action is to preserve your own strength and find a more opportune time to engage.
It's about picking your battles.
Exactly. And that highlights another key aspect of Earthseed. It's practicality. It's not a naive or idealistic philosophy. It recognizes the realities of power and violence, and it encourages strategic action.
So it's not just about having good intentions. It's about being smart and effective in pursuing your goals.
Right. And that's a really important lesson for anyone who's involved in social change or activism. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problems we're facing. But Parable of the Sower reminds us that change happens incrementally through strategic action, community building, and a steadfast commitment to our values.
It's about finding those points of leverage where we can actually make a difference.
Exactly. And it's about never giving up hope. Even in a world as bleak as the one Butler depicts, she shows us that there's always potential for change, for growth, for creating a better future.
So what's that one final takeaway you'd want our listeners to ponder?
how can we, like Lauren, embrace the inevitability of change while also working to shape it towards a more just and compassionate future? How can we cultivate both resilience and empathy in the face of adversity?
Those are powerful questions, and I think they really get to the heart of what makes Carable the Sower such an important and timely novel.
It's not just science fiction. It's a roadmap for navigating the complexities of our present and creating a world where everyone can thrive.
Well said. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure, and may we all find the strength and wisdom to create the future we want to see.